Thank you all for showing up. I know since it's been raining so much and today's absolutely a gorgeous day, you'd probably rather be outside, but I'm really glad that you decided that this is the place to be for the next hour or so. First off, I want to say the Office of Research and Creative Activities and the Faculty Research Lecture acknowledges our presence on the traditional, ancestral, and unceded territory of the Gabrielino Tongva people. I should introduce myself. I am Roger Wakimoto. I'm the Vice Chancellor for Research and Creative Activities. And I sincerely welcome you to the 135th Faculty Research Lecture. I should say from the start that we are recording this lecture, and it's primarily because we want to be able to post it on our website, and so people that couldn't make it have easy access to it and can view it at their leisure. Or you can replay it if you want to hear it again. The structure of the lecture today won't surprise you. Our speaker today will talk for about 40-50 minutes. We'll be followed by a Q&A. And then I think you saw it outside. We're going to have a very nice reception at the conclusion. And again, today's also a beautiful day, so I think all of us will enjoy that. Well, since the first day I arrived at UCLA, I looked forward to these lectures. I don't know how else I can say it. I always marked it on my calendar, and I always tried to make it a point to be here. I won't steal the thunder of Darnell Hunt. He will introduce today's speaker, but I wanted to mention that I've had a great pleasure of working with Dana, most recently with the UCLA Strategic Plan, and she was just an incredibly valuable member with lots of suggestions, had huge input into what ultimately became the UCLA downtown purchase, because I know that was a huge vision for her. So with that, I want to introduce our Executive Vice Chancellor and Provost, Darnell Hunt, who's going to introduce Dana Cuff.
Thank you so much, Roger. Great to see everyone. Great to see everyone. I want to thank Roger for and his office for hosting the 135th Faculty Research Lecture featuring Professor Dana Cuff. Now, this lecture series is one of UCLA's highest honors, and it provides an opportunity for some of our most esteemed faculty members to present their exceptional scholarship and creative work. We have tremendous talent at our institution, making important contributions to academia, and we also maintain a collective commitment to engage scholarship and finding practical solutions to society's most challenging problems. That combination of talent and commitment creates a lasting impact, not just on the academy, but on our city and on society. Over the next several years, we will be building on our legacy of excellence to position UCLA as the world's most impactful university. And continuing to enhance our research and creative activities is one of the keys to helping us reach that goal. Today's faculty lecture is a reminder of the impact of our scholarship and the power our respective disciplines have to improve our world. Engaged scholarship transports us out of the classroom and into the public square, inspiring us to pursue research and creative activities to seek equitable and just solutions to complex problems. Today's lecturer, Dana Cuff, is a professor of architecture, urban design, and urban planning, who exemplifies engaged scholarship. A member of the UCLA faculty since 1993, Professor Cuff's significant impact on California's built environment is nearly unmatched among academics today. Her work demonstrates the power that architecture has to influence lives and communities by helping us reach our environmental goals, supporting social justice, and preserving culture. Putting her academic work into practice, Professor Cuff has co-authored successful state housing legislation grounded in the research conducted by cityLAB, which she co-founded in 2006 and where she currently serves as director. As the founder and director of UCLA's Mellon Foundation-funded Urban Humanities Initiative, she has also worked to ensure future practitioners and scholars in the field continue to advocate for better housing solutions by helping build one of the most innovative social justice curricula in the country. Professor Cuff studied at UC Berkeley and has published and lectured widely about design and inclusion, architecture, and affordable housing. She has authored several books, including her most recent, Architectures of Spatial Justice, published in 2023. Professor Cuff's influence on architecture, urban design, and urban planning has been recognized through her many accolades, including receiving UCLA's Public Impact Research Award in 2022, being named Architectural Research Center's Consortium's Researcher of the Year and Educator of the Year by the American Institute of Architects in Los Angeles, both in 2020, and receiving Architectural Records Women in Architecture Activist of the Year Award in 2019. So please join me in welcoming Professor Dana Cuff as she presents her lecture, Architecture's Promise, Designing Equitable Futures.
Thank you, Roger and Darnell, for that kind introduction. And thanks to all of you for coming. It's really nice to see friendly faces in the audience. It's especially meaningful to me to be chosen by my colleagues in the Academic Senate to deliver the 135th Faculty Research Lecture at this great public institution. To talk about design research, thinking, and practice with a broad and intelligent audience comes naturally, since I've focused my career, as both Darnell and Roger intimated, on public impact. And in fact, I felt called to architecture precisely because it was the site where arts and impact are inseparable. And while colleagues at UCLA will attest that over the past decade, I've spent a good share of my time exploring the tremendous benefits of innovative transdisciplinary teaching and research, particularly through the Urban Humanities Initiative, this afternoon I'd like to return to my discipline of architecture to unpack conventional wisdom both inside and outside the field, to suggest that architecture's agency on behalf of social justice, its ability to design more equitable futures, is in its DNA. I want to call this architecture's promise. To build the world we want to live in, architecture makes a two-part promise, and these are extreme promises: to reverse the climate crisis and to advance social justice. Both are ethical commitments to the public of historic proportions that confront us now. Today's focus in this talk is going to be on the architectures of spatial justice, which is really entwined with the climate crisis. There's a trajectory that I can now describe retrospectively that led me through various bodies of research. The book that might be an appropriate point of origin is The Provisional City, a history of Los Angeles's housing since the start of the 20th century and its particularly violent demolition of neighborhoods of color undertaken by federal and local governments to build public housing. It was after that historical project that I was no longer content to study neighborhood upheaval and architecture's participation therein. So in 2006, with my colleague Roger Sherman, I founded cityLAB in the Architecture and Urban Design Department of the School of the Arts and Architecture at UCLA. It's a design research center that would comprise, over the ensuing years, a new form of architecture and scholarly practice. Through cityLAB, I undertook multi-year initiatives focused on backyard homes and schoolyard housing that are currently transforming California and LA's defining suburban landscape, which, as we all know, is supremely resistant to more equitable land use. I'll explain those projects a little bit later. All of this led to the Architectures of Spatial Justice book, which is the cornerstone of this talk and the culmination of the trajectory outlined on this slide. So let me begin by reframing conventional wisdom about architecture ethics, that is, making the world a better place, and aesthetics. This is an important reframing for the discipline, but also for public knowledge. So while architecture is understood in many ways as a business tied to neoliberal economics, as a technical science, it's also, and importantly, a form of art. Exceptional buildings like Disney Concert Hall, shown here, represent architecture's virtuosic aesthetic capacity. But for 2 decades, starting in the 90s, the discipline explored its autonomous formal project, architecture's independent history, material systems, its spatial logics. We struggled then with function. If, as Oscar Wilde stated, all art is quite useless, that was a bit hard for us to internalize. Or Walter Pater, the philosopher critic, put it, art comes to you proposing frankly to give nothing but the highest quality to your moments as they pass, and simply for those moments' sake. To uphold architecture's autonomy meant to set aside ethical demands that it might engender for the sake of aesthetics. But shouldn't this same art be brought to our everyday environment, not just to our highest cultural institutions, not just projects with big budgets and privilege, but to the public, especially housing like these examples, kind of quintessential Los Angeles housing, which seem left out of architecture's promise? What is the ethical responsibility and capacity of design? If we look into the history of architecture, probably the most obvious place to locate its ethics about the good life or a moral improvement is in utopian thinking and the long traditions of utopian thought that began in the 17th century. Robert Owen's vision here for New Harmony, Indiana, shows a strong material manifestation of that utopian idea. And I think this kind of Gothic fortress is a great example of the conflicting and complicated ideas that architecture and utopian thought together hold. The fortress holds out as much as it contains. A utopia is always a totalizing system, a kind of fascist system in its end state that has to control all aspects of life, and because of that, intrinsically fails. There were a lot of utopian projects that occurred in the early 19th century. Another strong set of utopian thinking and projects happened in the 1960s when we were imagining radical alternatives to nearly every aspect of our social life. Here, Archigram in England is looking at an idea that would require a giant state to build a giant infrastructure into which the primary construct of plug-in city was organized around, and that was the kind of dynamic and changing housing that could plug in and plug out as everyday needs changed. The idea of a utopian tradition isn't just a Euro-Anglo project, but the projects of Boris Isaac Kingeles, his incredible models of his adopted city, Kinshasa, under the title of Ville Fantôme, are another series of utopian projects. Kingeles said about these, "It's a peaceful city where everybody is free. It's a city that breathes nothing but joy, the beauty of life. It's a melting pot of all the races in the world. Here you live in a paradise, just like heaven." In his adopted country of the Congo, Mobutu fell just 1 year after this model was made, a kind of indication of what the utopian project stands against. So maybe it comes as no surprise that our own era's utopian thinking are alternatives or ways out of what seems like an inevitable demise, the rising sea level. This project by Bjarke Ingels has been evolving over years, now given a kind of legitimacy in its partnership with UN Habitat. But the idea, as you might imagine, thinking about our own lives, of moving to a floating city that is itself a kind of fortress, would there ever be enough of these? Who would govern? How would these interact among themselves? just is the tip of the iceberg of utopian thought as much more conceptual than capable of actually being built. So where does that leave us as architects or in the built environment for thinking about how we make change in the world? I'd like to turn now to Ruha Benjamin, a professor of sociology and of African American studies, who lifts up the work of people like Ron Finley here in Los Angeles, who calls himself the guerrilla gardener of South LA. And she wrote a book entitled Viral Justice, Out of the Pandemic, in which she points to a much larger story of how something as small and, in the case of the pandemic, pernicious as the coronavirus actually transformed the entire world. And that same model might be something that we could consider a principle of small actions having large impacts. And Ron Finley is an embodiment of this, where in a neglected and marginalized community of South LA, he doesn't accept the negative stereotype about that community, but instead acts on abandoned land with the community to make gardening a practice of providing fruit, of providing shade, and of providing a luxurious green zone where there's mostly gray. So I would say this is a kind of a turn from the sort of totalizing utopian thought to something we might call a minor or fragmented utopia, or what Benjamin calls viral justice. So let me just stop for a moment and offer a definition, which I will do in a couple of instances this afternoon. Spatial justice as a construct really was articulated best by our former colleague here at UCLA, Ed Soja, who wrote a book called Seeking Spatial Justice. His ideas about space might have been more abstract than mine, but he was really the inspiration for my thinking through spatial justice, and that justice has a geography. Equitable distribution and access to housing, services, amenities, and a livable planet are basic human rights. Thus, design and planning can counteract spatial injustice. And perhaps the clearest reading of spatial injustice today, particularly after the book by Richard Rothstein called The Color of Law, is the maps of redlining that were issued by the Homeowners Loan Corporation in 1939 that prevented any kind of lending in neighborhoods, particularly those of color, and particularly those with Black residents. This has then become the foundation for spatial injustices that we're continuing to try to repair from harm. Okay, so if Ron Finley gardens into a form of viral justice, what is architecture's version of the same? And I would just start with a project by Estudio Cruz and Foreman, colleagues at UC San Diego, who worked for over a decade with their local community in San Isidro to build something that they would call a community station. It begins with an abandoned church, and over the years adds a variety of programs, all meant for this primarily Latinx neighborhood, of immigration services, artist studios, affordable housing, youth training programs. It sounds pretty utopian in a way, but it's at a very small scale, and perhaps importantly, they see it as part of a network of other border stations that work both on the northern and the southern side of the American-Mexico border. And you can see that this then has become a kind of community center for all kinds of activity in San Isidro. So as we think about what the smallest increment of architecture might be to make an accessible environmental landscape, I'd like to just focus on housing today, because I think housing is such an important and central element of thinking through justice. If we shift the conversation about equity and accessibility in the built environment from utopian thought to design solutions that can proliferate, as Benjamin proposed in Viral Justice, an appropriate focal point is housing or accommodation. We can agree that housing is a basic human right, Yet our growing housing crisis constantly reminds us how inadequate our responses have been. At cityLAB, we started investigating what I call the continuum of accommodation, with sleeping unsheltered at one end and apartments and houses at the other. Are there unexplored forms of accommodation that can temporarily or at different stages in one's life offer accessible alternatives like youth hostels or pod shares or dorms and co-housing?
Yeah.
Well, this problem is very much with us right here at UCLA. When you look at the data about housing near campus, it's the most expensive in the city. And that causes problems not just for our students, but for our faculty and staff as well. How do we then bring some kind of alternative forms of accommodation, some kinds of more accessible housing into this context? With a number of the different departments here on campus, one of the real beauties of working through cityLAB has been finding the ways in which UCLA stands up for its communities through transportation services, student services, the recreation program. We soon came to realize that long-distance commuting was deeply overlapped with housing insecurity, that students and staff and faculty who traveled long distances to the campus were not only, but largely people who couldn't afford to live near campus and whose own housing conditions were pretty unstable. So we undertook a number of different kinds of research projects with these long-distance commuters, whose primary solution when we began was overnight parking, a kind of solution that really no one at UCLA wanted to push forward as a model for what we would do for these students. And with Marta Novak and some of the architecture and urban design students, we started developing what we called a napping, studying, sleeping pod that fit them ergonomically and fit their needs. So these students would, this is in fact built now at the Wooden Recreation Center in a former squash court. It's kind of a home away from home for students who never really felt they had a place where they were given the kind of dignity and joy that they felt they should be getting when they were attending UCLA. These students sometimes arrive, and maybe some of them are here with us this afternoon, at 6 a.m. to beat traffic. They bring their lunch, their dinner, they might bring their breakfast too, and they stay until 11 to get home after the traffic leaves. It's not a safe kind of circumstance. And with the Bruin Hub, we were at least offering them a place for napping, for studying, for Zoom meeting, and more and more often as places to stay overnight, which was part of our original intention. So in thinking about how this tiny increment, a kind of viral justice, might work, it's already spreading on the UCLA campus. Roger, you'll like that I've put these already in the Trust Building. That's a Photoshop, but we actually have put them already in the Strathmore Building next to the Basic Needs Center. There's a proposal that they go downtown in the Trust Building and maybe to another place on campus. And we've gotten many calls, so many universities have napping rooms for their students, but they have no dignity really or attention that design itself can bring to it. And here's another kind of example where I would say the aesthetics of design is bringing inherent dignity to the people who are occupying this space. And that kind of aesthetic attention has a moral component to it. All right. So now I'd like to stop again for a moment to return to what we've learned from some of these examples that I was just showing you. Further studies of built work that holds justice in the foreground has revealed over time for me a number of governing principles that are not widely recognized within the discipline or practice of architecture. These organize the book, and I'd like to share 3 of those principles with you by showing the work of architects from around the world as well as the work we are undertaking at cityLAB here at UCLA. All of these, again, concern housing. So the first is that we're designing generative projects, not singular solutions. The second is that it's leveraging design that's important to open the paths to the worlds we want. The third is that addressing critical issues at times of crisis is a responsibility that architecture's promise embeds. The other four, undoing the whiteness of architecture's history, creating radically public buildings and cities, engaging partnerships of difference, and building legible policy are all part of the book. So if we start with generative projects, this is what I've been speaking about in the case of Bruin Hub. We can look to a project that I think everyone in architecture and many people outside of architecture have seen before, and this is the work of Alejandro Aravena in Santiago, Chile, who builds these half houses as their form of public housing. And the idea is that this embodies for me in my work is that rather than singular projects with design solutions, which is the typical format for architecture, we have a commission, we act on it, we solve it, we get our fee, and we move on to the next one, often very disjointed as a form of practice. If instead we work with a kind of generative mentality, we create prototypes that proliferate and evolve and create ripple effects for other projects in other places. So Aravena's idea was that if we had to build housing more inexpensively, in this case in Santiago, maybe we could just build the most expensive, most technically complicated portion and leave the rest for people to build in the informal ways that they had been building their settlements up until this point, and in fact on this very site. And you see how effective that was. In fact, the Chilean government gave funds also for the materials for the infill, all of that being within a budget that could allow for housing to stay closer to the center of the city on more expensive land. And you see in the image on the lower right how that kind of unfinished interior operated for the families who moved in. Within a few years, all of those spaces were infilled, some with slightly more exuberance than the architect had originally intended, as you can see in the fourth floor that was added to one of the houses, which wasn't part of the structural thinking in the first place. And so as a project that would proliferate and be generative, Aravena was able in subsequent projects to begin to solve that by capping, say, the section that would be infilled. At the same time, he made all of the drawings for these projects. There were four in the end. He made all of those public information open access. Again, going against the idea that the big debates in architecture had been who owns the drawings. In this case, Aravena says they're for public use and let's build as many of these as possible. So some people would say, well, this doesn't have much to do with the American context. We have too much liability. People don't have that kind of building tradition, that our government wouldn't allow this. But as I thought about it, the idea of a half house was in fact what we might call our suburban landscape. Maybe it's more like a half lot, but there was a half of every property in a single family zone that still had a backyard that might be there for infill and for a second unit in this case. And perhaps the 10-year project that we undertook in cityLAB, looking at what we called then backyard homes, now sometimes called granny flats or accessory dwelling units, ADUs, started with something that hadn't been done before, and that was really looking at lot configuration. Because if we weren't looking at the generative baseline of what these kinds of housing opportunities were, we didn't really know what possible infill might naturally follow on. So this work began. We studied, I think, every aspect of backyard homes. We looked at the kinds of lots that would be naturally low-hanging fruit, large lots, corner lots, alley lots, where you might be able to add a second unit most easily. We looked at how those would grow over time, whether neighborhoods would find themselves overwhelmed by a second round of housing development. We also went to neighborhood council meetings. We did field surveys of Los Angeles neighborhoods where illegal or informal secondary units were already built on as many as 2/3 of the lots in some neighborhoods. And with Kevin Daly Architects, we also built a demonstration right here on campus of how a secondary unit might in fact be a sustainable, lightweight, low carbon footprint project that sits exactly on the same footprint as a two-car garage, with the sort of didactic message that we should be housing people rather than cars in our units, in our houses. I'd say that this project was one of the sort of cases of work in cityLAB. I'm looking at Jane Blumenfeld, who with me co-authored state legislation then based on all of that research carried by Richard Bloom at the California State Legislature and passed into law in 2016. One of the things I learned in working on this legislative effort was that really one of the main successes is how follow-on law really kind of builds upon, some might think erases, the law that you wrote yourself. It turns out it's a completely different notion of authorship, that instead of thinking that you're making something that you hold on to, you make something on which other people springboard. And there have been a number of laws, which would be a measure of the success of the law that we authored. There have been practices like the Mayor's Office Standard Plan Program, which is encouraging architects to submit drawings for secondary units that then can be checked out by any resident of the city and customized for their backyard. These have had certain kinds of problems, which we can discuss later. But other kinds of follow-on law, not just 2 units, not just doubling the density of the suburbs. The next law became a tripling of that, having a second ADU, and maybe more dramatically, SB 9 made it so that you could subdivide a lot into 2, intentionally trying to make that land more affordable that had been restricted from particularly people of color in the sort of suburban land grab, so that we could have 2 lots, each of those having 2 units, ending with 4 per site. Now, just as an example of how this kind of change happens quickly, when I first started working on secondary units, I was accused of trying to Manhattanize Los Angeles. By the time I'd been doing that work for a year, the students in the audience would say, "Why did you just double it? Why didn't you triple it or quadruple it?" And I could say now that that has happened without my intervention. All right, so if generative projects is one principle of achieving some part of architecture's promise, another part, which is very much tied to that question of aesthetics and its role in making the world we want to live in, is leveraging design. Architecture can contribute to the transformative change we seek by deploying design practices, the tools of its trade, at the highest level possible. And here I want to talk a little bit about anti-gentrification projects, because at least in Los Angeles, one of the main conversations that's been going on is how, as we add new housing in communities, how do we do that without displacing and gentrifying the neighborhoods where we're working? I'll hold up 2 relatively small kinds of efforts, but I think they hold that kind of viral justice idea in them, by which design was leveraged to achieve an anti-gentrification result. The first is by Theaster Gates in Southside Chicago, where he has restored and rehabilitated a number of houses that were deteriorating in order to lift up and solidify community values. So a bookstore, a well-known bookstore, and a well-known music store, both were going out of business, and he pulled their collections together and set up the Archive House. That's a small example, but at the same time, in the same community, part of the public housing was refurbished and turned into affordable housing for artists and for low-income residents in another section of the neighborhood. And you can see that with incremental and small means, Theaster Gates and his collective have been buying and transforming enough properties around this Southside neighborhood to hold it in place to value the belonging of the community that's already there. A similar, even smaller project, and kind of heroic in many ways, I would say, is that of the Congo Street Initiative in Dallas. Their street of primarily Black residents was constantly, for maybe 20 years, being threatened with redevelopment. That's a euphemism for being demolished and replaced. And the neighbors that were there found ways to continue to bring in slightly new, some smaller new resources to build a park, to refurbish their street, and eventually to collaborate with BC Workshop and students from UT Arlington to rehabilitate the neighborhood for the neighbors that were already there. And they did this through design, I would say, by starting by building a holding house. In the history of displacement, there's often a promise that the people who live there now will be able to move back in. But that never or rarely happens, because once the displacement has occurred, their social networks are gone, their claims on the land is gone, and the improvements make it less accessible for them in terms of rent or mortgage. So in this particular case, they built a holding house. Each family moved into that while their own house was so modestly upgraded and redesigned, as you see in the lower images. And each of the families that had lived on Congo Street stayed on Congo Street throughout the process of transformation. So as a kind of sneak peek into something that we're working on, which I hope has some of the same qualities, we're now working with the mayor's office on their attempts to try to overcome the housing crisis, or at least to build as much housing as possible in the city of Los Angeles. And we've been tasked with looking at the smallest of the lots that are owned by the public, that are owned as public land, less than 1/4 of an acre. And as you can see on this map, there's something like confetti across the city of these tiny lots. There's 4,000 of them, as it turns out, and they might hold somewhere from 2,000 upward new units of affordable housing. And because it's public land, we might be able to insist on their remaining affordable. And so we're going to work with, under the guidance of Manos Brasaloglu, who works with me at cityLAB, with the mayor's office to try to set up a design competition so that the architecture of invention and innovation might be a means to start to find solutions that could translate across some of these odd lots. All right, lastly, the question of critical junctures arises, like shared trauma or crisis calls for architecture's transformative capacity on behalf of spatial justice. At a breaking point, new collective possibilities can form and enabling policy can result. And here you see a kind of quintessential image of the Great East Japan earthquake and tsunami on 3/11 in the Sendai region of Japan. As a response to this, the Japanese government efficiently and very quickly set up resettlement, I don't know if you would call them communities, areas, which rehoused everyone who had been displaced. During the tsunami and earthquake, 20,000 people's lives were lost and 500,000 were left homeless. This is a huge resettlement project, and the government promised that it would only take 5 years to rebuild the communities. In the wisdom of the Japanese government, that meant leaving architects out and getting engineers to solve it, which one might think had intrinsic flaws. And our Japanese colleagues, in particular Hitoshi Abe at UCLA, helped organize one of the two primary responses to that problematic of a kind of engineered solution to the future of the Sendai region. Through ArchiAid, he and his colleagues gave the residents a voice through careful participatory planning in which, rather than having a solution imposed on them that made engineering sense, the people who lived in these villages and towns on the coastal area of Sendai, who were primarily elderly and also tied to ocean-based economies like fishing, had their say about what they would like to see in the resettlement, in the rebuilding of the communities. And ArchiAid drew those up so that the communities could take those to the meetings with the government to say, no, this is what we want. And it became a very effective voice for those people who'd been left out. A second group of architects under the leadership of Toyo Ito did another kind of project that's almost easier, I think, for us to understand and really fits in this model that I have of viral justice. They set up something called the Home for All project, and that was to basically build community centers in all of those kind of trailer-like resettlement areas during that 5-year period where people were displaced from their homes. Because in those isolated and individual trailer housing, there was no sense of community, no space set aside for collective life. And so through volunteer labor and donated materials, they built these kinds of community centers, almost 30 in all, each with just two programmatic elements, a kitchen and a place to gather. And the people who lived in those kind of alienating resettlement areas liked the Home for All project so much that they disassembled several of them and moved them into their permanent housing when their towns were reestablished. And so you can see in this that these are not distinct and separate principles of operation. Generative demonstrations, design leverage for change, and collective crisis actually are braided together into a single kind of motivation for making the world we want to live in. If we have a collective crisis here, it's every day on our sidewalks with unsheltered, unhoused neighbors. And we know this is a racialized problem, that Black and Latinx renters are more housing insecure, that Black residents are much more likely proportionally to be found amongst the unhoused population, and that there's a huge number of people who are also on the verge of homelessness. So there's a clear crisis-like condition that sets the need for transformative architectures of spatial justice. And I'd just like to, again, raise up maybe 100 feet from this issue to talk about what kind of research this means and what kind of research is identified through this work that we've been doing through cityLAB. And that is something I would call projective design research. It's a kind of research that knows its answers before it sets its research agenda. We know we need more housing. We may not know what type or exactly how to go about it, but we have a sense of a final goal. This distinguishes design research in many ways from empirical research or scientific research because it embodies that very ethic that I talked about from the start. So in all of the work we've been doing in urban humanities, as well as at cityLAB, the use of conventional as well as innovative research methods for studies that are expected to lead to a desired future outcome in the built environment and towards greater spatial justice is how I would define this kind of research. That hasn't always been the best way to get grant funding, for example, because they think you shouldn't come up with answers before you come up with all your questions. But some of the questions or the answers seem so obvious. I think it's been an interesting exploration in our team to find this new form of research. And you can see that, say, in the case of housing, production isn't enough. We can't just keep trying to produce more housing. We have to also protect housing. We have to preserve it. And we have to think through that as a kind of projective project. So I'll close by looking at one last project. This, in the kind of iterative nature of all the work that we do, the generative nature of one project leading to another, is what I would call education workforce housing. Because we couldn't guarantee affordability in the ADU space, they were private properties owned by private individuals who then would charge the rents that they wanted to. Those turn out to be slightly lower than other kinds of housing, but still not affordable enough. So we started looking for land that might be able to guarantee affordability. And schoolyards seemed like an interesting opportunity. There are 10,500 schools in the state of California. That's a lot of land. And there are teachers and staff members at the schools who can't afford to live there. And so there was this kind of natural coincidence of an ability to build and produce new kinds of housing for a population that was very much in need and really part of the future of California if we think about the fact that we're losing teachers and staff members to places where they can live more affordably. So of the 10,500 school sites, 4 had managed to build any kind of housing. So that seemed like an obvious bottleneck. Why was it that even though numbers of districts were interested, something like 84 districts had been looking into how to build housing for their teachers and custodians and cafeteria workers, only 4 had managed. 3 of those were in Los Angeles. That's because Los Angeles is the second largest school district in the entire country and has a real estate division. So it has a capacity. It's not school board members who are doing their best to do education reform or, practices. It was a district that had the ability to build housing, whereas superintendents and school boards could recognize the problem. They had no idea how to approach a solution. And the 4 that existed had taken about 8 years on average to build. That's 3 different school boards, as it turns out. They only last 3 years. So you could see there were sort of systemic and structural problems there. In the end, again, Jane Blumenfeld and I were fortunate enough to work with Richard Bloom and to write legislation that only took effect this past January based on all this research to enable and incentivize school districts to be able to build new housing on school land which we hope will cut the time in half and rezones all school land for residential use. But to show that the boundaries of architecture are not nearly so defined as we might imagine or even prefer, that question of capacity became overwhelming. And so with partners at the California School Board Association and at Berkeley, the Center for Cities and Schools, we're now running our second of 4 academies to teach districts how to build this housing and what it means to go through the development process and involve a number of architects in trying to work with those districts so that the buildings will end up being ones that we're all feeling as though the dignity and joy and importance of good design is also shared with the education workforce. So in conclusion, as I stated at the outset, I have a relatively simple message, and that is that architecture is a powerful, valuable aesthetic medium that can and must be expected across the built environment, not restricted to sites of privilege. And while so often we disciplinarians escape responsibility for the biggest challenges facing society or the planet, like the housing and climate crises, we in fact can effect change. As a society, we should and must expect architecture and urban design to be harnessed for all for good, to advance spatial justice. Our everyday built environment is fully capable of embodying a more beautiful, sustainable, and just world. One of the strongest reasons is because we can undertake small-scale practices that are intended to spread and go viral. Importantly, this is not a marginal or new practice, but one that's apparent when we lift up demonstrations that exist across the globe. These offer evidence of architecture's fundamental promise to make the world we want to live in. The future of our field, and more importantly, our shared public sphere, depend on it. I never give a talk without recognizing the creative power and dedication of the cityLAB team, many of whom are here in the audience. These 20 or so faces are joined by dozens from years past, along with cityLAB's important community partners, generous friends of the lab like Cindy Misikowski and Sarah Jane Lind, my family, Kevin, Julian, and Amelia, and not least the architecture students, faculty, and staff whose contributions really turn all my work into true collaborations. And at this stage, I'd like to invite Dr. Ananya Roy to join me on the stage and launch into some questions and answers. She's a model of impactful scholarly activism and my brilliant colleague in UCLA's Urban Planning, Social Welfare, and Geography departments, and director of the Center for Inequality and Democracy. Thanks, Ananya.
I'm just being loud, right? So, but the other piece of this then, to take it yet a step further, is what then is the decolonial ethics of spatial justice? So how then do we think about architecture's agency in relation to land back, to reparations, and other forms and practices that insist on a rethinking of land and property? I said it was one big question, so.
A very big question, and thanks, Ananya. Your thoughtful provocations are always influential in my thinking and in the back of my mind. I really appreciate the probing of some of the limits that we might have. Clearly, architecture is a participant in neoliberal land speculation economies. And if we think that we're going to undermine that from the start, we'll never get started. And I guess that's when Ruha Benjamin's notion of viral justice once again comes into play for me, which is that we really must begin a targeted attempt, for instance, to bring Indigenous voices into our conversations about cities. We need to think clearly about reparations and different kinds of regimes of reparations that we might be able to undertake and where architecture might play into that. But at some level that's not quite as fundamental as those, I do think that land is at the core of many of the things we've discovered were the ways into trying to think about justice in the work I've been doing for the last 15 years. And public land in particular is a way of locking in a kind of use and access that we could be more radical about, right? We could make it affordable, but we also could make it a reparations program. We could make it a land back program. 4,000 sites, for example. I don't know if anybody from the mayor's office is here to hear this, but with that many sites, there could be demonstrations of what some kind of small land back moves could be. They're so inadequate given the scale of the problem, but I I think that reading of a problem is one that usually leads to inaction. And so in my own work, I think small actions are the ones we can take and we must take. And I give this to our general audience here because I think the public at large, our clients, homeowners who've been left out, or residents who've been left out of home ownership can demand that of us. So this is something that a small act should be pressured by all parts, not just architecture and urban planning.
Thank you for that, Dana. Let's open it up for some questions. And there are colleagues with mics. This is being recorded, so don't be like me. Don't not have the mic on. So,
expanding on what you were just talking about, the schoolyard housing sounds great, especially given that I commute 2 hours each way to get here. But my question is, how do we avoid a company town fallout under those circumstances?
Meaning if it's all educators?
Meaning that when you have an employer-owned living environment, there's an automatic, inherent tendency to say, well, we're providing you this housing accommodation.
Yeah.
Why would we provide you other benefits as beneficial as you might find elsewhere?
Well, I think we will be watching these developments. I mean, one of them has actually been in California for 20 years, and I think it's got a waiting list of something like 70 households for 30 units. So, there's a kind of contradiction between, is it the best place to live, or is it the only place that people can afford? And because of fair housing laws and all kinds of laws, I think there are many mechanisms by which residents could prevent the kind of company town problem that you're talking about. These are public institutions, not private institutions that are seeking profit motives. They're really trying to get educators to bring their credentials back to California. So I think there's a slight protection against that problem moving forward. But we'll also see as more of them get built.
Hi, Professor. Thank you for your talk. I had a question regarding, I suppose, UCLA University housing. I think it's very beautiful to look at all these, these aesthetic architecture sites, and many of UCLA University apartments, one which I live in, are very beautiful to look at from the outside. But I think students, and I think a lot of undergrads would attest to this, fight tooth and nail to get into these apartments. And because so many of us are coming from different places, we don't know how housing works here. We're more or less at the whim of university housing. So you have students fighting to live with 3 other people in a single room in these beautiful external buildings. So I suppose my question boils down to, do you believe that having these beautiful buildings can allow places to justify inconvenient housing for people who have no other option, more or less?
Well, that distinction is the very one that I'd like to break apart, which is that somehow, well, first of all, that beautiful buildings, and I didn't mean to suggest that aesthetics alone make good design. Obviously, it's a much more complicated equation than that. But I think that the idea that to provide housing for everyone means to just get something built rather than to do it well is a false division. And that, of course, we can be working towards providing beautiful, well-suited housing for a wider range of students without having to assume that it's the beauty that's the problem, right? I mean, I think that's the mistaken association with privilege that we have to unpack. It's the assumption that good design just costs more isn't the case. I argue about this all the time, but there's some of the most beautiful housing we have is affordable housing. Some of the most beautiful examples of housing we have is housing that's been built by residents as well as by architects. So,
All right, another question there. Yes, go ahead.
Yeah. Hi. Hey, Dana. The slide that you showed, which had the percentages of the precarity of housing renters that are, exposed to being homeless potentially, was striking. And so my question is, in terms of affordable housing, how important is it that it be housing that is a pathway to ownership rather than affordable rent? And just to pack in another question, from what I understand, a lot of the funding for affordable housing is for Section 8, making, the first prospect rather difficult.
I'm not sure if I heard that last part of the question.
A lot of the funding for low-income housing is for Section 8, so it is not a path towards housing.
Well, there's a bit of getting in the weeds there, and so we could talk about this more afterwards. But I think the fundamental question about the scope of the housing crisis and the constraints that are coming with resources is a real one. So you're pointing to something that is a kind of structural problem. It's not like all the funding that's coming for housing could actually be used for the kinds of housing that we might think is needed. It's partly what led us to start looking into what that continuum, not that something like a study pod is a solution for housing, but that as a temporary need or as a particular need for a particular group of students at a point in time, it might stand in for a way of providing a necessary accommodation. One of the beauties of something, and now I'm going to diverge a little, but one of the beauties of providing something like the Bruin hubs, where housing insecure students are attracted to come and are met by the commuting student organizers and basic needs groups, is that we as a university can make visible a group of students who have been invisible in the past. And until the populations that are most precarious become visible, we actually don't usually solve any kinds of problems because we're not even clear what they are or who they are. And so I think in some ways that's why the tremendous crises of unhoused folks on our streets in Los Angeles has brought housing to the mayor's top priority, even if we don't think it's an always adequate response to that. It's made it so that it's the number one political issue here in LA.
Okay, hi, Professor Cuff.
Sorry.
My name is Walton. I am actually on the Southtail Neighborhood Council, and I'm very, very excited about this framework and architecture thinking you're doing here. And I would love to invite cityLAB and the UCLA School of Architecture to come and actually work with the Southtail Neighborhood Council in terms of thinking about applying this outside academia into actually a neighborhood council level, like neighborhood unit. That's sort of an invitation. My question for you is actually, in my work at the neighborhood council, I encounter a lot of sort of what I would think of almost as ventriloquism, meaning people all think they're just. Every project that they are proposing, they feel is the just architecture and just building, and that includes property owners, developers. So justice seems to imply sort of an arbiter of what sometimes it's contested. It's a contested concept. So my question for you is, how do we decide when both sides argue that their proposal is just?
Thank you for the invitation and for the question. Yeah, you're at the core, I think, of a kind of fundamental basis for everyone throughout history has been imagining they're going to make a better world if they're an architect or a planner, right? That's the No one's thinking they're going to make a worse world. And then people take that charge without really any kind of qualifications to justify their own actions. The history of people going in to help others hasn't been a promising one. And I think at the very root of trying to understand whose justice we're talking about means to be engaged in a way that is a long-term, embedded, listening kind of project. So that's not a simple answer, but it's a philosophically important answer, I think, that's justice for whom, which is really at the heart of your question.
Hi, Dana. It's great to see you. When we think about social justice now, there's kind of a challenge between people who are, for example, more absolutist and people who want to be just incrementalist, people who want to take big systemic changes and rock down the house in a particular kind of way versus people who are much more pragmatic and willing to take little trade-offs. And we see that in our teaching. We see that in different cohorts. It's just a hard problem. I was struck by the fact that when you describe what you do, sometimes it sounds very big, like generative changes, about thinking about utopia. When I think about art and taking art seriously, it seems in some ways not especially pragmatic, although I know you're going to push back on that frame. But other times you point out that you have to be viral. You have to be opportunistic in finding spaces and getting deals done, building things, demonstration proofs, all the stuff, right? And I'm just trying to figure out whether architecture, in part because it's committed to art and beauty, drives you more to absolutist changes and utopian frames, or allows you to see pragmatism and incrementalism? Or if you think that it's actually indifferent, you have artists who do both. I'm curious.
Yeah, that's an interesting question. I think I would say that the discipline of architecture tends towards the aesthetic agenda questions that draws you out towards broader principles and towards more broad-scale claims, whereas the practice of architecture forces you into an incrementalist step-by-step approach. And really the reason that I started cityLAB was to get into that dialectic in a way, because, in scholarly life, we're always working towards these larger questions. And yet in kind of moral life, we're always trying to work towards doing something that's useful and helpful for good. And I don't want to do that without some of this. And I don't want to have just this be guiding my life. So I think that would be the same in law, in a way, in any of our scholarly practices where there's both a profession or practice and a theory and a history. You can get that kind of tension into it, which is why I think of the professions as being a kind of spearhead into the future of the university, in a way, not just a kind of place where students can learn jobs that get them incomes. We hope that too, but.
I'm an adjunct professor, so this is not my field. I'm in theater. But I know as a homeowner, it took me a long time to buy a home, and I built an ADU. And I decided that with the ADU that I built, that I would rent it to active senior, because they had no place to live either. Whether if they had no family, they were left having to either put themselves into a home. But if they're active, I think that they're a group that we should also look at. Now, in the neighborhood that I live in, and I guess this is my question, and I hope it's a good one or a bad one. But I'm in the Van Nuys area, and they have very, very large lots behind all the homes where I live, which is right next to Van Nuys High School, where, a lot of movie stars went. And we're uneducated there because we've been getting phone calls saying, let us buy a small portion of your backyard. And we're all like going, huh? how can someone buy a small portion of my backyard? Because nobody is educating us on A, is that possible or plausible? B, what is it for? C, will it do good for the city where you can build another ADU and rent it out to a student or populace? I don't know if you know anything about that, but I think it would be a great education for us to learn.
You think we should start a backyard housing academy like we've done for school districts is probably true.
I really do, because people want to help.
You're kind of pointing out this discovery we made early on, which was that anyone who has a house also has a backyard house story. And in that sense, if the original form wasn't exactly democratized, the problems that it presents and the opportunities are much more common than people tend to think. But
yes, all right. Thanks, Dana. Brilliant as ever. Mine is to take you back to something that you sort of skimmed over, which is the relationship between housing and cars and public transportation. And we see this all this building going on around Palms and areas that are directly accessible to UCLA, and yet Los Angeles is notorious for the ratio of space for cars to space for houses. And judging by it looks like great, it's going up right by the metro, but it's got 2-car garages for everything.
Yeah.
And the traffic's only getting worse. So it's radical incrementalism. How could we turn the whole process of LA around to other great cities where you had a very different ratio of space for cars to space for people?
So, Chris, is your question that since we have so much car space, that makes us have more future of housing space, or should we be thinking more about cars?
I'd like us to think about turning the car space into house space.
Yeah. Okay. I like that. The solutions we have that we've been exploring generalize to some extent, but they're not panaceas by any means. So the kinds of solutions we might have arrived at here in Los Angeles, turns out they work in a lot of cities, but not every city. And we're learning a lot from other cities at the same time. But I'm kind of hoping that in this next generation of housing solutions, where people have gotten over the idea that a second unit on a single family lot is Manhattanizing, but that now we might have much denser housing, that we will find those kinds of solutions that are more applicable to a walking city, to a city that has metro, like, we're starting to see here, and that the kinds of solutions, particularly around those transit areas, get another whole set of solutions. I haven't explored those, but, we can look, if we were to pull out the examples that are happening around those sites, I think we'd find an equal number of really interesting demonstrations of what's possible there.
So thank you all for your questions. I know we'll all be thinking for a while about our role in minor utopias and in making viral justice in LA and elsewhere. So thank you, Professor Cuff, and I'd like to invite Vice Chancellor Wakamoto back to the stage.
Well, that was just a wonderful example of community engaged scholarships. I want to thank Dana again. I want to thank all of you for coming in, those very thoughtful questions. And now please join us outside. You can continue the discussion with Dana and enjoy the light refreshments that we have.